Hello, and you're listening to your Majesty's Secret Podcast. I like my podcast shaken, not stirred. Only on the Four-Eyed Radio Network. If you'd like to check out more shows, go to foureyedradio.com.
Hey listeners, Eric here, also known as Trekkie B47, from the Starfleet Escape Podcast and the Ranger Command Power Hour. The more phenomenal episode you're about to listen to is brought to you by Raven Designs, illustration and design that fit your personality. For samples and inquiries, visit ravencruise.com.
Bond. James Bond. Shaken, not stirred.
Utter one more syllable and I'll have you killed.
I thought Christmas only comes once a year.
For your eyes only, darling.
I never joke about my web 007.
For England, James?
Come in, Univex. James Bond here.
Am I going to have a problem with you, Bond?
Allow me to introduce myself.
You're that secret agent! That English secret agent from England!
No, you're cleverer than you look.
Still better than looking cleverer than you are.
My God, what's Bond doing?
I think he's attempting re-entry, sir.
007 reporting for duty.
Hello, the name's Berkeley, Ziggy Berkeley, from Cinema on the Rocks, and with me is Eric Dewey from Socially Awkward Studios, and you are listening to Her Majesty's Secret Podcast, only on the Four-Eyed Radio Network. Yes, this is the show where we discuss bondage, James Bondage, all things 007, and today we're going to be going into the short stories of Ian Fleming. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the ones that are collected in For Your Eyes Only, and in what, depending on which version you pick up, is either just called Octopussy or Octopussy and Living Daylights. There's a little fun with the publication details on that one.
Yeah, we'll have to get into that in a little bit more detail when we get to those stories, but yeah, it's a little crazy on that one.
Yeah, and one thing that you notice when you start reading all of these short stories, most of which, not all, but most of which were originally published in magazines and newspapers like Daily Express, Cosmopolitan. Yes, Ian Fleming wrote for Cosmopolitan. And considering what a frickin' misogynist the dude is, that is just so hilarious. Playboy, hey, we all knew that. Hell, he had novels show up in Playboy. Sunday Times, New York Herald Tribune. So it's been around. So these were around mostly before they went into the story collections. There's only actually one of these stories that first appeared just pristine in one of these books. So these are just collections, the first one of which, For Your Eyes Only, came out right after the last book we talked about, which is Goldfinger, and just before the start of the Thunderball trilogy, or Spectre trilogy, or Blofeld trilogy, whatever you want to call it.
Right. However you want to term it, the trilogy.
Yes. And what you find when you read these stories is a lot of little elements that showed up in films of other titles were were taken from these stories, or a few different stories got put together to make one of these movies that was titled after them. So there's little bits and pieces of recognition going on. You'll see it as we talk about them. Yeah,
it's really kind of weird, actually, to read through these books, having seen all the movies, of course. And, you flash back to bits and pieces when you read these bits of the story that are that were taken and used in the movies. And it's weird because it's all over the place sometimes. You're reading one story and something from a completely different titled movie pops up and you're like, wait, what? What's going on here? But it's fun. It's really fun to see how they kind of picked and chose what little bits here and there to use to make the movies. So it's very interesting to go back and read these. If you've never seen any of these movies and you're reading these fresh, I'm not sure if you're going to have the same impact, but since most people, I'm sure, especially most people listening to the show, have probably seen most of the movies, if not all of them, I would definitely think that you're going to get those flashes of recognition, which are real fun.
Yeah, and you also get something that goes beyond the standard James Bond story. This is, I think you're starting to see in these stories, even though he was supposed to have gotten over it after From Russia with Love was successful, because, of course, he tried to kill off James Bond before. But you can tell there's a little bit of burnout in some of these stories, because Fleming isn't always writing Bond as enthusiastically. In fact, a lot of these are little side trips that just happen to have Bond showing up, but aren't necessarily what Eric would call Bondy necessity.
Yes. There's one in particular that I'm probably sure you know which one I'm talking about when we talk about it. It's completely, it might as well be Bond free. It's there's no Bondy necessity whatsoever. I mean, the fact that he appears in the story is the only way it can be tied into a Bond theme.
And even with the rest of them, there are some where the ties are so light that you just have to question why. And then there's another one as well where the tie is definitely there, but he didn't really have to be there at all for any reason.
Right.
So but we'll get to that as we go through these. And then after we're done talking about them in detail, we will be rating them from 8 to 1. And some of you who are familiar with the short stories may be scratching your heads thinking about the number there. We'll get to the discussion of why we have the number we do when we get to talking about that book. But first, we're going to be talking about the stories that appear in For Your Eyes Only, which was originally published in 1960. It's a collection of 5 short stories, only one of which is brand new for this collection. The rest appeared elsewhere, either first or simultaneously, from 1959 to 1960. And in fact, the first story in the collection, From a View to a Kill, was originally published the year before in the Daily Express under a different title. It was called James Bond and the Murder Before Breakfast. So,
kind of glad they changed it. I don't Murder Before Breakfast. You know what? Actually, I don't know. It's starting to grow on me already, but I don't know. It just doesn't seem quite right.
And, of course, they played on that in a certain movie where they referred to Death for Breakfast. So, but I'm bummed. Yes, we know what movie ripped off everything and everything, so. And it's, the title, of course, is, the secondary title, From a View to a Kill, is where the movie A View to a Kill got its title. And the only thing that ties those two together is the fact that we have a setting that includes Paris. And that's really it. There's no other tie here.
Yeah, we don't. There's no blimps. I don't recall any blimps. There was a severe lack of Christopher Walken. I didn't hear him at any point during the reading of this book. Yeah, there's not really a whole lot tying this one together other than the title.
Amazingly, no microchips, being 1959. Imagine that. But that's another thing. It is very firmly grounded in the era. This is still post-World War II Reconstruction. So this is prior to the Berlin crisis, which, of course, ended up with the airlift and so on. That was still in the future. So even though it's 14 years after World War II ended, it took a long time to clean Europe up. And so this is still in that era. What were your overall impressions of the story?
Being the very first one that I read, it became pretty apparent pretty quickly what I was to expect from these short stories. I think I was expecting more when I first went into this because I hadn't previously read any of his short stories. So it was kind of, I was expecting, I mean, with the books, with the novels, it gets really intricate and there's a whole big plot line and a subplot and this is happening and sometimes it takes half a book before any action happens. And with these short stories, it was very much just a little piece. And that's how it felt to me. It felt almost like it was just a little piece of something else as opposed to necessarily an entire story. And that was kind of weird to me, I felt, because I've read other authors' short stories where you get a complete story arc. It just happens to be in a shorter format. You know, less words, but you still get the full story. Whereas this, it really felt like there was something before and something that comes after, and we're just getting a little piece of it. It's almost like a sample more than anything else. I don't know if you felt that way when you were reading them or not.
The action pieces are very short. In fact, sometimes they're non-existent. There are some of these stories where they don't have any action pieces at all, and then the rest of them, they are very few and very quick. It's mainly looking into Bond's mindset, and I think that's the thing that sets the short stories into something that is coherent. If you can say one thing holds all of these stories together, it's that they're focused on the mindset more than they are on the action. And that's very much the case in From a View to a Kill, though, ironically, considering that we just started having this mode of discussion, it's also the one that has some of the most action in it.
That is true.
And the way that the story starts out is we are in the late 1950s, and of course we're still before the era of trusting everything to computers and so on and so forth. So, first satellite had just been launched into outer space 2 years before and went beep, beep, beep. So, we weren't really doing the modern stuff yet. So we had dispatch riders on motorcycles going from one base to another, handing over the daily, or in this case, weekly intelligence traffic. And so as the story begins, we have a British dispatch rider going from one base to another on the weekly run, much to the chagrin of NATO, which would rather that Britain use NATO channels, but M and his service have decided that they still would like to be a little independent. So dispatch rider is going along, and he's doing his happy, at the speed limit, which is kind of odd when you think about European highways. But anyway, and so he's tooling along, and then he sees another dispatch rider come in behind him, which he thinks is odd, but he recognizes the uniform, recognizes the bike, thinks, oh, hey, he's trying to catch up with me, so I wonder what's going on. Maybe something happened, maybe there's more information we need to hand over, maybe we can have a drink later. But as soon as the other dispatch rider gets behind him, he shoots him dead, and of course hides the body and takes all the intelligence traffic and disappears. Now, this scene, I actually very much like how this particular scene was set up, because what you have is you have it from the killer's perspective, not from the good guy's perspective. So I like it when he starts out with how the bad guys are thinking, kind of a la From Russia with Love. I really enjoyed that, how that came about. What did you think?
I definitely agree. It was very well told, and it was very interesting to see that perspective, especially right from the beginning when we're seeing, this is our introduction to the Bond short story universe, and that's what we see. So it's definitely an interesting take, and it does draw you in right away. Like I said, with these being short stories and them being short, they do leave you wanting more, because you're not excited that they're over. You want some more. So it's very very well done. This is one that I enjoyed.
And then after this, we then get introduced to Bond's part in the story. He is in Paris. He's doing a layover, a la Anthony Bourdain. No, not really. If Anthony Bourdain did some of this stuff, he would not be able to air it on commercial television, even cable. But no. Bond is in Paris, and it's at the tail end of a mission that turned out to be something of a cluster. It was a failure. Remember, Bond gets to fail in Ian Fleming's universe. And so he's spending a night trying to figure out what to do with himself, decides to go to a cafe, and one of my favorite Bond insights in these stories comes right away in this one. It says, one cannot drink seriously in French cafes. Out of doors, on a pavement in the sun, is no place for vodka or whiskey or gin. And so he's basically saying you have to drink lousy drinks when you're at French cafes. And when he comes up with something called an Americano, which is not the watered-down coffee that I think most modern audiences would think of it as. No, this is bitter Campari Cinzano, a large slice of lemon peel, and soda. And for the soda, he prefers Perrier, because expensive soda is the best way to improve a poor drink.
Yeah, I did, at first when I saw him order the Americano, I'm like, oh, he wants a cup of coffee. That's weird, because, he's talking about drinking. And, we know that Bond prefers coffee over tea. He's not a traditional Brit that way, but still, it threw me off. Because here, when we order an Americano, it's usually at a coffee shop, and it's espresso watered down, which is just weird to me. I'm like, if you're going to get espresso, just get espresso. And if you want coffee, just get coffee. But, hey, if you want to make it fancy, get an espresso and then water it down and call it an Americano, because that's how they roll, evidently. The only time I've ever actually seriously ordered an Americano was at someplace that did not have any regular coffee. They only had an espresso machine, and I didn't feel like an espresso. I wanted a full cup of coffee, so I was like, all right, fine.
Yeah, I personally tend to go for either assuming we're not adulterating the drinks with alcohol, of course. Either straight espresso, which I don't mind how bitter it is at that point. I mean, let's face it, straight espresso tastes like denatured tree bark. However, the awful taste is also part of what makes it work so well, because that contributes along with the heavy caffeine to waking you up. Or I soak my coffee down with chocolate. Yes, I like mochas. Mochas. Yay.
My favorite part about the Christmas season is being able to get peppermint mochas just about anywhere instead of having to make them myself.
You still can in most modern coffee shops. You just have to ask for them specifically. Yeah. And they'll charge you an extra 40 cents for the peppermint shot.
Sons of guns.
But then after Bond orders his frou-frou drink, and that's basically how he describes it, he then goes on to decide what his fantasy is going to be. So we have Bond's sex fantasy. All right. So basically what he's looking for is someone with dark hair, with blonde hair, who does not have dark roots. So apparently he does not like cheap dye jobs.
Yes, the carpets must match the drapes, evidently. The carpets? Anyways.
Carpet and drapes, unless you go for hardwood, you know. But, yeah, because... And then he automatically assumes that any woman he's going to find for a one-night stand is going to want money. So he just proposes to throw tons of money at her right away. So basically, he's hiring out. The hell, man.
You know what? And I don't necessarily have a problem with that, because I mean it fits his lifestyle, really, of being a transient in love, not looking for any serious relationships, and you don't have any emotional drama when you go that route.
You don't, but compared to how the character is portrayed in the movies, where he just is able to do this naturally and everyone just agrees to have a good time and that's it, I mean, this Bond is basically turning it into a prostitution transaction.
Yeah, exactly. He basically wants that level of intimacy, meaning none.
And it's interesting. One movie that I suggest that people look at, in fact, we may look at that at some point, that goes along this same line, is what I would consider the best Charles Bronson movie ever. It's called The Mechanic, and he plays a hitman. And one of the things that he does is he hires a prostitute to pretend to be his actual girlfriend for a night. So, fix him dinner, care about how he's been doing. Hey, haven't seen you in a while, that sort of thing. But it's a prostitution transaction. She's not his real girlfriend, even though she's actually played by his wife. This is kind of what that reminded me of. It's kind of creepy, but like you said, I can picture it with the character. And he even goes so far, and he says, I would propose to call you Donatien, or possibly Solange. So that's where the name comes from in Casino Royale, by the way, because those are the names that suit my mood for the evening. So he's fantasizing about this girl he wants to prostitute. And then when he figures, well, that's not going to happen, I'm probably just going to get drunk and go to my hotel and go to bed hating Paris like I have since World War II, because that's what he says he does. When suddenly someone who looks just like his fantasy shows up. Oh my goodness. And she comes right for him.
What a queen.
Oh, she's probably married. Something that every guy in the world has probably thought about somebody. But no, she's coming straight for him. And indeed, she wants to pick him up, give him a ride in her car. And of course, she is a British agent saying, you've got to come in. M wants you.
Son of a gun. Isn't that how it always goes? You're out, you're having a drink, you're fantasizing about the perfect woman you want to pay for something, and then she shows up, but she's not there for that. She's there because your work needs you. She is a human pager.
I would say that would be more pleasant than the incessant beeping.
Yes.
But considering that I don't often fantasize, or in fact ever fantasize in quite the same way Bond was doing, because I try not to think of money with those things, but But of course, as we've probably figured out by now, she's there because M wants him to get to the bottom of what happened to the dispatch rider. Turns out that NATO thinks that it's just some random thing and they're ready to just kind of forget it. But M wants Bond to check it out. And even though there's not much evidence, he knows that Bond can look at, quote unquote, the invisible factor. So he's actually trusting Bond to see what no one else can see, which is pretty fair, I think. And so he goes about his investigation with no cooperation from NATO whatsoever. But of course, the dispatch rider falls in love with him almost immediately, because that's just what happens. and he doesn't even have to pay her.
Ah, so on the bright side, he's got that going for him, which is nice.
Yeah, and so what ends up happening is Fleming takes advantage of genuine institutionalized racism and finds out that the invisible factor is no one thinks of gypsies in Europe because, they're just kind of there. You don't think of them as human beings and so on at this point in time. And in fact, unfortunately, some people still think that way. And Bond, of course, is immediately suspicious and discovers that this quote-unquote gypsy camp is actually a Soviet spy camp.
But of course...
What I found actually really interesting is he did not try to then tie it back to Smersh. The only time, really, you see Soviets inside of an Ian Fleming story that does not go back to Smersh. Instead, they're actually tying it back to the GRU, which is Soviet military intelligence, by the way. Very different from the KGB, much like CIA and naval intelligence are different in the United States, that sort of thing. So different services. And Ian Fleming didn't play the Smersh card. I was surprised.
Shocking. Yeah, it was kind of interesting to see it go a little bit more along the normal lines as opposed to immediately going towards the Smersh. And no Spectre either.
Well, that hadn't happened yet. That was the next story.
That's right.
So, but what he does do is after building up this realistic thing, he then kind of goes the movie route because this gypsy camp is hiding a secret underground base. It's a tiny base, but it is a base.
Yes.
And it has a little periscope coming up out of the ground disguised as a rose bush. So it's kind of got the little movie panache going on.
Mm-hmm.
So he's getting influenced a little bit. This is not the standard type of thing. He's going a little more over the top.
Yeah, I definitely agree. That was a fun moment, I thought. That was one of my favorite parts in the story, actually, when he starts, watching this rosebush and sees the individual flower seem to move by itself and rise up a little bit above the rest of them. And then the petals open up and he can see the reflection of the glass in the middle and can tell that it's a lens and sees it looking around. So make sure that the coast is clear before people come up out of the base. That was a fun moment, I thought, because it had that Bond movie feel to it.
And then you also had descriptions of the craft that the Soviet agents are using to make sure that they stay hidden, carefully covering their tracks, walking in what amounts to snowshoes so that they don't leave a trail. And then Bond, of course, formulates the plan to become the substitute dispatch writer the next trip out so that when the murderer comes after him, he can turn the tables. And then once he has killed the Soviet agent, then go back to the base and raid the base. And so we have our other moments of action. Bond, of course, does his deed. And as he's raiding the base, it looks like, okay, we're about to have one of the most successful Bond adventures ever. He has gone totally against the odds. He has done everything right. And then, just because, he almost gets killed. But fortunately, the girl who is still in love with him saves him. So again, because it's a Fleming story, Bond screws up.
But it all works out in the end. It's fantastic. No, actually, I really did enjoy this story. It like I said, it left me wanting more, which I think is a good sign. However, it was, it is a short story. So if you go into it expecting a long, drawn-out story, you're not going to get that. What you're getting is a piece, a little taste, a sample, if you will, of a full Bond story. But it's still fun. It's definitely worth the read. I definitely recommend.
Indeed. And then what we have as our second story is the one that gives this collection its name and the only original story to any of these collections. Again, the rest were published elsewhere, either first or simultaneously. And this is For Your Eyes Only, in which Bond avenges a murder. And this is, of course, where that movie got its title. And indeed, what transpires in this short story, part of it, including some of the names, does make it into the movie of that title.
Yes.
Motivation is different and location is different, but there are some, and of course no fun Citron chase, but we still have some elements. Now, the start of it all is we have a retired couple from Britain who used to know M. The gentleman used to work with M in some service capacity, we're led to understand, the Havelocks, and they own some of the best land in Jamaica. Well, it turns out that, and this is where you have something of a historical perspective, because they start talking about Cuba, and this is before Castro took over from Batista, not the wrestler, the former dictator of Cuba, the one who was propped up by the United States and the American mafia. And so this is where we're still having the pre-Cuban revolution type stuff going on, because Castro hasn't quite won yet, but they're expecting it to happen. And what's interesting is that between this and another one of the stories that deals with Castro's Cuba, Bond actually expresses some sympathy for Castro. And if you remember, Bond is an absolute communist hater. So it's kind of interesting to see that when he says he isn't entirely unsympathetic to Castro, because he recognizes Batista for the jerk that he is. But then you also have to remember that Castro didn't fully declare himself a communist until after he was until the Americans had made it very clear that they were going to oppose him. Then he went for whoever was going to give him his aid. I mean, he always had the socialist leanings, but the full communist didn't happen until America told him to go to hell, basically. But just that little statement of sympathy between this and another story that deals with that aspect, I found interesting. But in any case, one of Castro's lieutenants, not one of Castro's lieutenants, one of Batista's lieutenants, who is starting to fall out of favor and who sees the writing on the wall and wants to get out before Castro takes over, decides he wants to buy up some land in Jamaica. And the Havelocks have land that he wants. And they don't want to sell. So since they don't want to sell, he sends some of his agents to kill them. And then he says, I'll just go on threatening your daughter after this. Of course, the daughter is Melina. Now, because the Havelocks were close personal friends of M, he may have even stood up in their wedding. He can't officially do anything about it, but he wants to. So as much as it pains him, he hires out Bond as a private assassin, basically. How did you feel about how that played out?
It was interesting on the one hand, because I thought, like, okay, this is what we've always been told that Bond essentially is, but yet we don't usually see that aspect of his job played out. Now, in this case, of course, it's as a favor for a friend more than an actual official duty, but at the same time, you do get that kind of feeling like that is his job. It's just, he's not being asked necessarily through the proper channels this time, but it's not something that we see very often in the movies. It's usually a much more grandiose adventure that he's going on, as opposed to just a straight up assassination. But it's weird. I feel like I shouldn't have liked it, but I did.
I did as well. I liked that aspect of it. And of course, they both rationalize it as, well, this was basically the same sort of thing. It was an unsanctioned hit against people who represented Britain, had service to Britain, and it's a sovereign attack on British territory if you really want to stretch it far enough, if we drink enough, and so on and so forth. So they do their rationalizations. Bond accepts the job, and it turns out that this Cuban lieutenant, since he has fallen out of favor with Batista, is now hiding out in northern New York State. And so just across the border from Canada. So Bond flies into Canada, and M has co-opted some assistance from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, get him some intel, some weapons, tell him how to get into the U.S., and of course arrange for him to stop at the Cozy Motel. That's capital K, capital O, dash, capital Z, E, Motel. Wow. I'm sorry, my James Bond does not ever stay at the Cozy Motel. My James Bond is when Daniel Craig says, I would rather stay in a morgue. I won't even stay in the Cozy Motel unless I absolutely have to. I mean, come on!
It really does sound like the kind of place that rents by the hour or even half hour, because it doesn't sound like a high-class establishment, that's for sure.
It sounds like what it is. It's a cheap motel, but super, super cheap. Like, without even restaurant facilities or anything. Just everything brown and musty, and you don't ever want black light in the room. It sounds like a dump. Now, of course, the James Bond of Ian Fleming's novels has stayed in many dumps, but this one just, because of that name, specifically, it just really rubbed me off. And now I understand it's because I've been I have been poisoned by the movies, so to speak, which the movies had not yet come out as of this time. He had gotten to the point where you knew they were going to be made. The deals were in the works. And so he was getting cinematic in his thoughts. Mm-hmm. And yet we have the cozy motel. It just struck me as wrong. So then he goes into Northwoods Hunter mode, goes into the woods of New York, and we discover a detail that I also didn't expect, but which I was kind of amused by. Any idea what detail that might be?
No, I'm not sure what you're referring to specifically.
Well, it turns out that as he's traipsing through the American woods, he reminisces about some of the things he likes about the United States. And one of the things that he likes best, chipmunks. He loves chipmunks.
Chipmunks are cute. I mean, come on now.
Closest I was going to get in this episode, folks. Had to work it in somewhere.
There were no chickens. Dang it. But
there were no chickens. But there were chipmunks. And James Bond loves chipmunks. Honestly, Fleming says so.
Hey, if he says it, it must be true. And, I mean, really, what's not to love? I mean, they're cute. They sing their little songs in a high-pitched voice. You know, it's all good.
They really are. And there's a place that I used to have breakfast at every so often where they actually have a small-scale village built up outside the dining room window with Ferris wheels and buildings and all sorts of things. And the wild chipmunks run into it and grab peanuts out of it. And everybody just watches the chipmunks. And frighteningly enough, after seeing Bond stay at the cozy motel, I can totally see him actually taking a step up to going to this place for breakfast, because it would be a step up. It actually is much nicer.
And he would enjoy the Chipmunk show, evidently, because he loves the chipmunks. So
he does.
There you go.
Chipmunks. But anyway, so once he gets to finding this Cuban person who is named and the killer is named Gonzalez, by the way. So that's the other tie-in that we have. He just happens to. I mean, over a month has gone by, okay? And couldn't have possibly known when he was going to fly in, when he was going to, traipse across the border and so on. Who does he run into? Melina Havelock, who also just happens to be there to do the exact same thing on the exact same day at the exact same time, coming along the exact same route.
But
why? Because. How did that strike you?
It was a little convenient, but I kind of allowed it in my mind because it is a short story. We don't have a lot of time for build-up and, for grandiose explanations of how certain things happen. So, allowing for time, it's kind of like a lot of times you see this in movies and TV shows where certain things happen. You're like, yeah, it wouldn't have happened that way. It wouldn't have been that easy, but you have to push the story along. And so I kind of glazed over it because I just thought of it as a plot push. But you are right. It's way too convenient, but at the same time, otherwise you got no story.
Yeah. And mechanically, I understand that. In fact, I don't have a problem with it when it happened in the movie. I mean, obviously not in New York with chipmunks at a swimming pool, near where we're doing chestnuts and things. But it's just, in a movie, it's easier for me to take than in a book. I think that's the difference in media for me. I will allow so much more out of a movie than I will allow out of a book. Once you get onto the printed page, I just expect a different standard, a more detailed, a more exacting standard, and maybe that's snobbery on my part, and I will totally own up to that, but that's how I see it. I like you said, you have to do it for the story, and I went along with it. It just rubs me differently in a story than it does in a movie. And of course, once that happens, they have their little peeing contest about who gets to kill Gonzalez and who kills everybody else and so on and so forth. And Bond does not take her seriously at all. This is man's work and so on and so forth. And then how did you feel about how the killing actually went down?
You know what? It was okay for me. I didn't really think that it was... It was kind of expected, but at the same time, I was okay with it. I didn't really think that there was a big issue. I thought it was a little bit weird, the way he was originally dismissing her, and then it's like, oh, okay, fine. But at the same time, she had kind of proven herself at that point as well, considering that she had snuck up on him and managed to kind of out-sniper the sniper himself. So, I think that's the way the story needed to go. But it was a little off. I will say that. It didn't really click, but I understood.
I think it was the way it needed to go. It's just that in terms of how it played, it just seemed the actual killing moments, that whole scene, it struck me as not written very well. I just thought it was kind of a mess. And it was just, okay, I'm throwing this in there because it has to happen. I don't really have all the words down, but I got a deadline, so I'm just going to throw out whatever's there. It just didn't feel as polished as most of the rest of the stuff. Mm-hmm. It just seemed kind of messy and almost anticlimactic in the way it played out. I never had a moment where I felt like, okay, it's done. It was just like, oh, it happened. It was almost like the ending of Never Say Never Again in terms of how it played out for me. And then, of course, right afterwards, you have Melina, who was a moment ago, out sniping the sniper, really tough, and she's crying. She can't handle it because, of course, she's a woman. And, of course, Ian Fleming has to point out that it really is man's work. That just, yeah, I get it. It's a Bond story. It's the 50s. But in terms of even consistency of character, I'm not even going with the just ethically, I don't agree with it. Just in terms of consistency of character. It's the same way I felt with Carrie Lowell's character in License to Kill. Just, you portray her as this tough person, and yet she'll cry at a drop of a hat. Just pick one or the other. Don't do this wishy-washy crap. Pick one or the other. That's all I'm asking here. But of course, no, she has to cry, and then Bond has to take her to the cozy motel. Watch the chipmunks.
Hey, check out what those chipmunks are doing. We should do that.
Bow, chipmunk, bow, wow. So, any other thoughts on For Your Eyes Only?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's one of the ones that I think brought up the most memories of the movie. Simply, I think mostly because the name's involved. Other than that, it really doesn't follow very closely, but it's definitely closer than the previous story. It's definitely got more.
And certainly closer than the next.
Yes, but. Yeah, it definitely was not one of my favorites. I wouldn't say it was bad. I don't think any of these were bad necessarily, but it definitely was not one of my favorites.
And I will also say that Melina shooting the crossbow into the dude's back when he's diving off the diving board to the swimming pool was a much cooler way to go than how the story plays out. So the movie did better.
Yeah.
Now, moving on, we have a story which you can almost think of it as Ian Fleming starting to think about writing The Spy Who Loved Me, which we'll get to in the next time that we talk about books. We'll be talking about that one, but not in this one. Just because it's moving further away from Bond. In fact, this story does not need to have James Bond in it at all. This is a completely non-Bond story.
Yep.
This is Ian Fleming kind of stretching his legs out, but realizing that no one's going to read his stuff if he doesn't have Bond in it. So, and that, of course, is Quantum of Solace, which is where the movie gets its title from, and the movie has absolutely no relation to this whatsoever.
None at all, and for the movie's sake, that is a good thing.
Though with that said, the title Quantum of Solace actually makes sense in this story.
Yes.
Because they explain what it is. So how would you describe this story?
It's really tough to describe. When I was reading it, I was just I kept waiting. I kept expecting something to happen, and it didn't. And so I was like, I don't understand why this is a Bond story. And that's how it left me feeling even at the end. I was like, why was this a Bond story? I just don't understand at all. It was more of a story being told, and not a particularly interesting one, but just being told, and Bond happened to be there. There's another one of these short stories that we'll talk about that's similar in that respect, but I found a little bit more interesting. But this one, it definitely didn't leave me feeling happy.
Yeah, this is definitely not a happy story. It is, in fact, kind of depressing in terms of it will not make you like human nature. What we have is Bond is once again in Jamaica, and he is at what he considers a very boring dinner party after finishing up a mission, and he's just waiting for the hour when he can politely leave, and he's just encountered a couple whom he thought was especially dull, Canadian millionaire and his wife. And then he's talking with the governor, and they're like, so. And Bond has his private assessment in his mind of how this guy must be really, really a dull man, even though his job could be exciting if only he would let it. And meanwhile, Bond himself is bored out of his mind. Mm-hmm. And then Bond happens to say, off the top of it, just off the cuff, just as a remark that he wasn't even thinking about, if I was ever going to get married, I'd want to get married to an air hostess, which, of course, it would then be called a stewardess, and which would then be called a flight attendant. Mm-hmm. And this piques the governor's interest. He says, oh, really? And then Bond goes on about being waited on hand and foot and all that sort of thing, and how she's only there for your comfort and so on and so forth. And then he says, haha, but I kid. I would never want such a thing. This is, of course, before he met Tracy, because that's a couple books away. And this is long after the bitterness of Vesper. And the governor says, well, that's interesting. And then he goes on to talk about a theory of his, which he calls the quantum of solace. And that theory is that any couple can work as long as they at least have some feeling about each other. In other words, where they have some ability to comfort each other, where they give a shit whether the other one lives or dies, preferably lives. And as soon as you lose the basic humanity of the relationship, that's when it's over. So when you lose the quantum of solace. So you have solace being the thing that you're seeking in a relationship, and once you lose that, that's when it's done. So with that explanation, suddenly the name makes sense. So how did you feel about that?
It was interesting. It was kind of it was interesting to learn the origin of the title, because previously I didn't really know where that title came from. It was just kind of, oh, it's a cool string of words, we'll use that. But the story itself, I mean, it was very much a daytime television type of storyline. If anything, I'm not sure if this is the one that was this the one that appeared in Cosmo? Had to be. Tell me this was the one that was in Cosmo.
It was the one that appeared in Cosmo.
Yes, okay. That makes perfect sense to me now.
And this is also, by the way, the one that was written the earliest. It appeared in May 1959.
Okay. That makes the most sense to me, because it really does have that feel of a daytime television show, a soap opera type of thing. Not in its, long, huge story arcs, but just in the human drama, as opposed to the action drama that we are expecting from a Bond story, and instead what we're getting is a human love story. Well, I don't know, love story is a strong word, I think, but
yeah, because basically what we have, Bond is a non-participant. He is the passive listener to the same story that we're listening to.
Exactly.
The only place he has is as the listener. Bond is us in terms of how this story goes. Mm-hmm. And the governor ends up telling a story of a couple where you had a low-level British civil servant who ended up meeting an air hostess, and she was the first person that he ever fell in love with, because she was the first person who really paid attention to him. And she kind of thought, by his way of thinking, that this was a guy who was going places. So within a month, they got married, and he got transferred to Bermuda, which is where the governor happened to meet this gentleman, because he was apparently this gentleman's immediate supervisor. And what you end up reading about is how after a first few months of idyllic marriage, suddenly she decides that she's not getting out of this what she wants, and you have the basic humanity of both the man and the woman going away. So their quantum of solace disappears because they can't even stand to be humane to each other. And it's just the story felt longer than it really was.
It definitely did.
Because you have the very detailed, these people are really mean. They end up hating each other, despising each other, treating each other like complete crap. She ends up gallivanting around the island, sleeping with whomever, even has a steady boyfriend who she has move in. And she's spending all this guy's money and basically running his career into the dirt by reputation, and he's putting up with it like a dormouse. And so she is just really, really clawing into him, basically. Evil vixen stereotype maxed out, almost what you'd expect out of Ian Fleming. So then The man gets an assignment to America for 6 months, and in that time, the woman's boyfriend dumps her, and she realizes that, I've got nothing else that I can do except hang on to my husband, so I'm going to try and beat him here and make it up to him. Well, he comes back, and nope, he literally draws a line down the middle of their home, says, this is my half, this is your half. You will only speak to me when spoken to. I expect my dinner at 8 o'clock. In a year, I'm divorcing you. And he just treats her like a non-existent piece of garbage for the next year. And it's just, it's the reversal of roles. Again, totally inhumane behavior on his part, just treats her like crap. And then when the year's over and they divorce, he hits it again. It's just psychologically, they damage the hell out of each other. I mean, did you see anything in here other than damn?
Yeah, it was pretty much just bitter bickering back and forth. It was mind games being played with each other. Basically, it was domination on one part or the other, back and forth. And it was a little tough to read, just because it was kind of, first of all, here I am expecting a Bond story, and this is what I'm getting. So there's that. And, second of all, yes, they were just evil to each other. And I would hope that no matter what, I've had relationships in the past that did not work out, and I've had, slight feelings of animosity towards those people in some cases, in other cases not. But I've never ever had a relationship that ended that I wanted to hurt somebody that badly after the fact. Like maybe brief glimpses of, I'd really like to stick it to them, but no, it's not worth it. But never where I would spend a year or more purposely trying to make somebody's life miserable.
Yeah, I mean, this is torture and abuse on both parties. It's just pretty intensely evil. And then after all of this awful stuff happens, then the man goes off to continue his civil service in Britain, except his career kind of takes a dump after that, and he's a shell of a man, never the same. So he just kind of fades off, a bitter husk. And the woman, she is basically downtrodden, dependent on charity, until finally one of her old society friends says, well, I can get you a job on another island send you off to the Bahamas. You can work at the reception desk. She takes it, and we kind of wonder, okay, what was the point of all of this? And it turns out that the woman, while she was at the reception desk, met a Canadian millionaire. They got married, and she was the female half of the boring couple that Bond had found so just dull earlier on in the party. So that was the whole point.
That was the whole point of the story, yes. And it was a bit of a letdown. Because I was still, at that point, expecting, okay, somebody's going to pull out a gun. There's going to be some shooting. Something's going to happen. A bomb. A blimp's going to come over. Something is going to happen here. I was expecting the entire hotel to be lit on fire because it was being entirely powered by hydrogen or something. But no. That was it. That was the story.
So basically a relationship story about people abusing the hell out of each other. And one becoming a bitter husk and one living happily ever after.
Exactly.
Only in Cosmo. And now, moving on from Ian Fleming writes for Cosmopolitan, we go on to Ian Fleming writes for the Daily Express in a story that came out, and this is kind of interesting. It came out in the Daily Express on the same day that the For Your Eyes Only story collection was published in book form. Exact same day, April 11th, 1960. Except in the Daily Express, this story was called The Double Take, whereas in For Your Eyes Only, it is called Risico, which is basically risk spoken with a heavy accent, which honestly, I wish Ian Fleming wouldn't have written in, because it's kind of jarring. It's kind of like when I read Stephen King-Reg accents. Even when they're done accurately, they get kind of annoying to read. Yes. I know there are two schools of thought on that. Me, I'd rather just have some identification of where this person is from, what their accent is supposed to be. Maybe if there's one little tick you can throw in, but having all of their dialogue written in accent, I'd rather just know what the accent is and put it in my own head. What about you?
Yeah, I kind of agree, mostly because I don't do accents well, and so even trying to read when it's written in that way, you'd think it might be easier, but it's not. My brain is always trying to translate it back into just normal talk. So yeah, I'm with you. I would prefer just write it. Tell me if they're supposed to have an accent. I'll put that in my brain, and I'll hear it better that way than trying to read it spelled out phonetically or whatever.
Yeah, and so what we have at this story, and this is wholesale used in For Your Eyes Only. Just actually only very small changes made to it. Now, to get our catalyst, we have M sending Bond off on assignment because there is drug smuggling going on into Britain. And you're thinking, well, what does that have to do with British intelligence? Well, somebody has the cockamamie idea that it's actually being funded by the Russians as a means of subverting the British population by creating a nation of addicts. So there has been some discussion, and over M's objections, the Prime Minister said, no, your section is going to look into this. And Bond draws the straw.
He does. So he's sent off to Italy.
Yes, and their contact there is someone who has done smuggling for the side of the Brits and also does work for the American CIA. There's a conspiracy theory that ended up breaking a long time later. But anyway, and he is Ari Christatos. And if we've seen the movie, we already know what's going to happen here. And Christatos says, oh yes, I know who is smuggling all of these drugs into Britain. Most of the heroin in Britain comes from this one man. And if you eliminate him, you eliminate your problem. And then, of course, they negotiate price for getting the information. Bond has been told he has £100,000 and he can go to 200 if he needs it. Christatos graciously says, for £30,000, I will let you in on this business, but there is Risico. Yeah. And the person who he fingers is Columbo, not played by Topol. We don't know who plays him in this particular story. And he happens to run the establishment where they're having this discussion. So again, familiar ties to the movie. Mm-hmm. And I found it interesting the way that Columbo was able to listen in on the conversation. Because there's an empty chair that happens to be near Bond's table. And this chair ends up getting moved from table to table to table. And nobody notices, even as it's taken into Columbo's office, where he then takes the pad off the seat and gets at the tape recorder underneath and, of course, listens in on what was being recorded. And Columbo even has a girlfriend, Countess Liesel von Schlaff, and he sends her Bond's way to figure out what he's after. Bond goes after Liesel. Fortunately, she's not killed this time, but instead he is kidnapped by Columbo, and Columbo says, no, it's not me. I show you who's really smuggling these drugs. And then we have basically the warehouse raid scene from For Your Eyes Only. Mm-hmm. And I thought this played out really well. I enjoyed this scene. I thought this was a great action scene.
I definitely agree. I thought this was one of the better stories, and definitely the action was much more fun. And like I said, it really invoked the movie a whole lot more because it is so much closer to the story. Yes, it is just a little piece of the storyline from the movie, but it's so much closer than anything else that it really tied it back in my mind. And, I saw this one play out much more easily than the others.
Yeah, it just all the imagery was right there. It was so easy to do. And of course, we find out that Christatos is really behind everything. And he is, in fact, working for the Russians because we have to tie it back to the Russians somehow. We can't just have this be normal drug smuggling that's subverting everybody's head. And in this story, Christatos takes on the role we see Locke play in the movie in terms of he starts to get away and Bond kills him. He doesn't have the kicked car over the cliff thing, but it's relatively close. Mm-hmm. He shoots him dead while he's driving a car. But overall, I thought this played at a great pace. I liked the action. The only thing I really didn't like was the accents.
Yeah, that was a little tough. Now, granted, I did listen to this one in audiobook form, so I didn't see it written out that way. And the person who was doing the reading did a good job of distinguishing the individual characters without making it sound awful. Like, there was definitely points when I was like, whoa, is he overdoing it? And then when I did see some of the writing in print, and I said, oh, okay, no, he's just reading it as it was written. Okay. So it wasn't as bad for me because I was listening to it, but
I do think there is a difference between an audio performance and reading, because once you're in the audiobook, then yes, it's a performance, and then I expect the accent. But
right,
yeah.
And the person reading in this version of it that I was listening to did a good job of kind of towing that line between it being offensively stereotypical accent and just being able to distinguish the characters from one another.
Yeah. So,
but no, I did really enjoy this story. Yeah, like I said, it was one of the least original as far as, to my mind. Obviously, it was original at the time it was written. I'm not saying he was copying his own movie that hadn't even come out yet. But it still played out the best for me. So I really did enjoy this one. That was my take on it.
All right, and that moves us on to the last story in the For Your Eyes Only collection. This is one where you get a character name and a boat name that are eventually lifted into another movie, which is License to Kill. Otherwise, has nothing to do with any Bond movie at all, and in fact, doesn't really feel like a Bond story to me. It's called the Hildebrand Rarity. And what we have is James Bond in the Seychelles Islands, and he's supposed to have been running an intelligence assessment for the last month, determining what threats there are anywhere. And basically, Bond's assessment is the only threat is that anyone assigned here is going to really become enamored of the tropical climate and the women. And that's about it. Yep. So he's got a week to kill. And a friend of his, who happens to be a member of one of the most prominent families in the Seychelles, says, well, I know this guy named Milton Crest, who has a boat called the Wave Crest. He's a wealthy American, and he runs scientific surveys as a tax dodge. Basically, that's what he's doing this for. He uses his pleasure yacht to try to find rare specimens of sea creatures, which takes only a few weeks of his time, and he then uses the whole thing as a tax write-off. And apparently the IRS is looking at him and trying to catch him at the tax dodge, so he has to come up with something really spectacular to take the heat off tax-wise. And so he proposes to look for this one fish that has only ever been seen once and never captured. It's called the Hildebrand Rarity, named after the gentleman who saw it first. And then take this specimen off to the Smithsonian, where he will get a fat check and also get the IRS off of his back. And so Bond's friend is going along for the trip, and he asks Bond if he wants to come along. And Bond says, sure. So we meet Milton Crest, who is the most obnoxious,
oh my gosh,
quote-unquote ugly American
yes,
out of stereotype you could ever come across. And, of course, he abuses his wife with a whip.
Yes.
Which
whip made from a stingray tail.
Yeah. And we get a whole long explanation at the start of the story of where this kind of whip comes from and that it's illegal to even own a stingray tail in the Seychelles because this is so awful. And so what were your impressions once we got on the boat?
I really did feel like it was a big dig at America, because it was that typical, like, okay, here's the only American we see, and he's a gigantic asshole. I mean, he's just a humongous jackass. And not just verbally and, in his mannerisms, but he's also an abusive asshole. I mean, he's really the complete package here. He's got to be the one talking at all times. He's got to be cutting everybody down. Like, the only way that he feels good about himself is to cut everybody else down. And he thinks it's all fun and games. And anybody who thinks otherwise is quite simply wrong. And if he has the power to, he will make sure they know they're wrong. And of course, the person that he has the most power over is his poor suffering wife, who gets the tail end of it, so to speak, with the corrector, as he's named his stingray tail whip. It's tough. It's a tough read because of that, because you don't want this guy to succeed in anything in life. Basically, you want to see this guy meet a terrible, terrible end. And that's where the story gets a little bit satisfying, actually.
Yeah, and along the way, he not only abuses his wife physically and verbally, he also treats this other gentleman who is Bond's friend, who is one of the most prominent people in the Seychelles, like dirt, won't even call him by his right name, and basically says the Seychelles are a pile of crap islands, and treats Bond so-so until finally he decides that he's some kind of cretin and starts treating Bond like crap too. And then we get to the point where they're supposed to be looking for the fish, and Bond actually starts thinking about sabotaging the whole expedition because he finds the fish. And he's like, I don't want Milton Crest to get it. I really don't want him to get it. I don't want him to get it. And Crest sees the fish, and he starts acting like, I discovered it. I'm great. I'm awesome. I'm going to pour in this poison into the sea that will stun this fish and kill everything else around it. And, oh yeah, Bond, stick your face in there, won't you? And which I found kind of odd that, okay, so it's going to kill all the fish, but you can stick your face in there. Okay.
Evidently, that's okay. Well, they explained it. What it does is it affects it clogs up the gills of the fish. So if you don't have gills, I guess you're okay. I don't know.
I don't know that I'd want to chance that anyway.
Yeah, me neither. But yeah, you do get that sense. This is one of the times when I was actually a little bit disappointed in Bond in the story because he thinks about sabotaging it, but he doesn't follow through. He ends up allowing Crest to pour the poison in and kill all those fish. And he's even thinking about it. He's like, how long does this last? How many fish and other creatures in the sea are going to die so that we can catch this one that he needs just to help out this guy who's not even a good person? Who, it really, you can tell he wasn't happy about it, but he ends up going along with it in the end. And that was a little disappointing. I would have liked to see him do something there.
And in fact, Bond is the one who finally retrieves the fish.
Right.
So then after we get the fish, then we're heading back to the seashells, and everybody gets a little drunk at the party, and it's decided that Mrs. Crest goes a little bit too far, and she's going to need the corrector again. And then there's some words, and everybody ends up getting insulted. And Crest is like, Bond, if you don't decide to play along and be my friend here, then I could just throw you off the boat. Basically threatens him. Bond takes it, and then later on in the evening, Bond is out on the deck about to go to sleep, and he hears Crest beating the shit out of his wife.
Yep.
And does nothing.
Yeah. Again, he thinks about it. He even starts heading in that direction before he decides, nope, this is between man and wife. I have no business in here. And that was the point where I was extremely disappointed in Bond, because that's not who I want my Bond to be. Yes, he may be slightly sexist, but he's not going to take that. He's not going to be abusive or accept abuse. And that really grated on me when he stopped himself and didn't go and save her from her husband. And I was like, what the heck are you thinking, dude?
Especially when in other stories he has.
Exactly.
He has intervened. So
yeah. And I think, ultimately, where the story ends up going, you can see that if he'd have intervened there, it would have been tough to complete the rest of the story the way they want it to play out. But I would have rather him not have heard it. Like, we knew it was happening. We knew it was happening from the way he was talking before they even went to bed. Bond didn't need to hear it for us to still know that it was going to happen. And once he did hear it, I would have expected him to take action, and he didn't, and that was disappointing.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of poor storytelling. And then, of course, he also later on hears Crest snoring away, and then suddenly hears those snores stop. Wonders what happened. Goes up on the deck, and he finds the precious fish stuffed down Crest's throat, and Crest choked to death.
Yay! Yay!
And he's trying to figure out who did it. Now, we all know who did it.
Yes.
But no, he has to pretend that it could be the wife or it could be his friend. Both were belittled. And then he decides, okay, fine. He takes the fish out of the guy's mouth, dumps Crest's body into the sea, makes it look like an accident, like he fell out of his hammock, goes back to bed, says nothing. Next day, it's like, anyone seen Milton? No? Aw, gee. Oh, look, his hammock broke. Oh, he would have fallen back way too far. I guess he's dead. Aw, gee. And so the long-suffering wife ends up inheriting everything and decides that instead of to the Smithsonian, she's going to donate the fish specimen to the British Museum. And would James Bond like to take a boat trip with her?
Which is amusing, considering at this point he is pretty much sure that she is the one who did it, although it is never admitted or stated for fact that it was her. There's still the supposedly open thought that it still could have been this other guy, or in theory it could have been any of this. There was staff there as well, so it in theory could have been somebody else, but you pretty much know it was her, and you pretty much are okay with it at this point in the story.
Indeed. So that then concludes the Hildebrand Rarity, and it also concludes the For Your Eyes Only story collection. Now we move on to a more nebulous story collection, which has existed in 3 different forms. And depending on what form you get it, most modern forms will just call this collection Octopussy. The original form of this collection was called Octopussy and the Living Daylights. It was published posthumously in 1966. It's a rather short collection, and depending on what edition you have will depend on which stories are included in it. The first edition that came out included the story Octopussy, which was published posthumously on its own in the Daily Express as serialized story, and it also included The Living Daylights, which was published in 1962 in the Sunday Times. Now, later editions also included The Property of a Lady, which was originally published in that ill-fated month of November 1963, in a publication called The Ivory Hammer, which was the annual publication of Sotheby's Auction House, which makes kind of sense if you consider what the story is about.
Exactly.
And this is the most common edition of the book right now. Even though it's not the last edition, it's the most common one. If you get this on audiobook, this is what you're going to get. Yes. If you get this in a published story format, this is probably what you will get, even if you try and get it right now. However, there have been later editions where it also included a story originally published in October of 63 in the New York Herald Tribune called 007 in New York. That was not the edition we went with. We went with the edition that contains 3 stories. Yes. So we are not going to include 007 in New York as part of this review, discussion, etc. And I actually feel okay about that because, again, it's not included in most common editions. It is still very hard to find. It's even hard to find one of those editions. If we come across it later, we will. What it's generally described as is a supplementary piece that led to Ian Fleming's book Thrilling Cities. It's more of a travelogue piece of Bond just describing what New York looks like. So if we do find it, we will discuss it later, but at this point, we're not including it in this discussion. Yes. So we're only talking about the version of the book, Octopussy, less than 100 pages long, that includes Octopussy, The Living Daylights, and The Property of a Lady.
Yes. So that is where we get our 8 count from there, the 5 from For Your Eyes Only and 3 from Octopussy and the Living Daylights. So now, anybody listening out there, if you have, in fact, read or have a copy of the version that includes 007 in New York, we'd love to hear your take on that particular short story. Please feel free to drop us a line. You can comment on this particular episode on our website at hermajestiespod.com, or you can tweet at us. We are at hermajestiespod. We are also on the Facebooks. You can go to facebook.com/hermajestiespod. And you can email me, Eric at hermajestiespod.com, and you can email Ziggy as well.
You can email me at ziggy@cinemaontherocks.com. You can also tweet me at cinemaotr.
Yes, so we're plenty accessible. If you've read that short story, or if you have any other questions about the show or anything that we talk about here, please feel free to drop us a line. We want to hear from you.
Indeed. And that brings us to our discussion of Octopussy and the Living Daylights. Again, published posthumously. Ian Fleming had already passed on for quite some time. This particular collection was published in 1966, and the first story in it is Eric's favorite title. Come on.
Octopussy. Favorite title, definitely. However, definitely not my favorite Bond story, and that's because Bond is, once again, in a similar fashion to Quantum of Solace, not necessary in this piece whatsoever. He's not really a character in the main part of the story. He is a listener. He's an observer. So it's kind of at least it's a little more interesting story than Quantum of Solace, but ultimately not very much of a Bond tale. Especially compared to the movie of the same title, which has next to nothing to do with this other than the title.
It does have one other thing to do with it. Basically what we have is we have the story of Major Smythe, and he is living comfortably in Jamaica, and he has a nice estate. Go figure. Lots of Ian Fleming characters live in Jamaica on nice estates. There's even what may be a reference in passing. I haven't quite decided if it's true or not, to what may be Honey Ryder's property. The name's never mentioned. He just describes a girl's property, and it almost struck me as it might be Honey Ryder, but could never really say. And this man turns out to be living with a terrible secret, because back in World War II, at the close of the war, he was part of an intelligence unit that was responsible for rounding up Nazis, gathering information from them, and then processing them off to wherever they needed to go. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that he found out during one of these raids that there was a hidden cache of Nazi gold. He didn't tell the rest of his unit about it. Instead, he kidnapped a German citizen who was not, in fact, associated with the Nazis. He was just a trail guide. And he then co-opts this person to show him where this gold is. He doesn't tell him that he's actually looking for the gold. He just knows where on the map it is, but he needs a guide to get him over the nasty terrain.
Right.
So this gentleman shows him where it is. Guy spots the gold, and he kills his guide, murders him with shots to the back of the head. Oh, no. He then steals the gold, manages to smuggle it out, and he uses it to retire to a very nice life in Jamaica, where he is having the gold slowly shaved off and sold a little bit at a time. And he gets away with this for 25 years. In the meantime, he's had a lovely marriage. His wife died 2 years ago, and the joy is kind of out of his life. So he's devoted himself to marine biology, and he's specifically looking to find out some things about the fish in his local area, and he's also trying to tame an octopus in the local lagoon. And it is the octopus, and not a daughter of his, which is named Octopussy. However, the story of Major Smythe, if you'll remember, in the movie Octopussy, Octopussy says she wanted to thank Bond because Major Smythe was her father, and in fact has the tale of a British agent being sent to bring him in, gives him time to settle his affairs, and then Major Smythe is allowed to finish things out honorably. That is the story of Octopussy, with just a few small details changed.
Yes, and that's basically all the story is. I mean, it's an interesting tale. However, you hear it, it's completely flashback. It's not even necessarily told. You're just to understand that Bond already knows this is what happened, and he's going to confront him and be like, hey, we know, so, here's what's going to happen. Either you die, or you get court-martialed, and then you die in prison. So, like I said, Bond is completely unnecessary. It could have been any random officer of any type of court that just needed to show up and tell him, hey, we know. I was a little let down, I think, by that, because I was expecting it at least to end with Bond performing his assassination duties or something, but no, he just walks away and says, hey, we know, so we'll be back in a week to arrest you. Figure out something to do between now and then.
Yeah, and of course, in that week, Major Smythe decides that, well, the gig is up, but he wants to complete his marine biology research, and he wants to see what would happen if the most poisonous fish in his local pond, the scorpion fish, were to be eaten by the Octopussy. He wants to see if the octopus would survive eating the poisonous fish. And so he captures the scorpion fish, and then as he's swimming it over to Octopussy, he realizes that he has in fact been stung by the scorpion fish, and he is about to die a painful death. But before he does it, he still wants to go on with his experiment. So he goes over to Octopussy and reaches out for Octopussy, and Octopussy's tentacles come up, and instead of reaching for the fish or just tamely shaking his hand, Octopussy pulls him down and kills him before the scorpion fish venom does. So he gets a double nasty death.
Yes.
Which then Bond reads about in the paper and writes off as suicide, which is kind of what he thought was going to happen anyway.
Yeah, he never said, Smythe never said for sure, like, I'm going to go kill myself now. But he definitely, it was obvious that he was taking all the risks, basically. Everything that he had tried to avoid doing in the past when dealing with Octopussy and the other fish, he was going to go ahead and do this time. And it did exactly what he was afraid it was going to do before. It killed him. But now he didn't care because he would rather die.
And the thing that struck me as the most off-kilter, and it in relation to Bond's participation in the movie, the character of Octopussy, who of course is Maud Adams and not an octopus.
Well, she does have a small pet octopus.
Yes, but in terms of, she says that Bond gave him 24 hours to clear up his affairs. And so basically, like, he was still hanging around the area, but gave him 24 hours and then he was going to bring him in if he didn't do something to himself. That makes sense. I can picture that. Until, of course, we find out one particular detail, which I'll get to in a moment. But instead, Bond says, yeah, okay, I kind of thought so. I'm going to write a report now. It'll take a week or two, and then someone else will come collect you. I am completely leaving the island.
Yeah. Bye now. Yeah.
That makes no sense. It's like you're giving the guy a chance not just to kill himself, but to escape. I mean, that just strikes me as incredibly crappy work. Yeah. Just terrible spycraft. Terrible civil servant craft, for that matter. I didn't get at all. 24 hours and you're still hanging around, fine. But bailing and just saying, well, someone else will come get you in a week or two, that struck me as odd.
Yeah, it's one of two things. It's either just poor work or not caring whatsoever about your work, or it's he knows so well that this man is going to kill himself, that he's not going to take any other options. He's not going to try to flee. He's basically, I think what Fleming was trying to get at was that they knew this man so well at this point that they knew what his choice was going to be. They knew he was done running. And whereas I don't think you would want to leave that up to chance, they were convinced that they knew him so well that they could do that. I don't like it, but that's where I think he was going with it.
Yeah. And it especially strikes me as wrong in this case, not just for the professionalism aspect, but for why we find out Bond was the one who extracted the story from him. It turns out that Bond specifically asked for this assignment because it came about when they discovered the body of the German climber who had been murdered, who, it turns out, was the man who taught James Bond how to ski after he had been orphaned, and whom Bond describes as a father when I needed one.
Yes.
Okay, so last short story collection, you're going to go and kill off some guy you don't know because your friend wants revenge, and now you want revenge and you're just going to let the guy sit? What?
Exactly. Yes, that did strike me. Again, I was expecting him to fulfill his assassination duties at the end there. I really thought that's what it was going to be. Like, he's going to tell him, oh, you've got a week or two to get your affairs in order. Let him. I'm thinking, okay, he's going to give him a false sense of security. He's going to start thinking that, oh, I can get away, I can plan. And then Bond's going to be there to be like, nope, haha, click, click, bang. But no, he literally does walk away, and he's not anywhere near when he hears about his death, and it is a bit shocking. You'd think that there would be more emotion there, but
yeah, there's just nothing. But that's the title story from the Octopussy collection, and then after that is the other story that was published in the original version, and that is The Living Daylights, from which, of course, the movie gets its title, and it gets its title from the exact same quotation, scared the living daylights out of her, and that's how this story ends. This is basically the scene from the movie where we have James Bond being set up as a sniper while somebody is going to escape from Soviet territory and into Allied territory, except the setting is a little bit different, and this is historically very interesting. Because again, we're talking post-World War II. The Cold War is still getting to its real freezing point. I mean, it existed even at the end of World War II, but it really is at that little crossroads, because between what we have is a British agent on the Soviet-controlled side of Germany trying to get out, and he needs to cross from East Berlin to West, and there's basically this little no man's land of bombed-out area that he has to run across, where he knows Soviet agents will have a clear shot at him. Mm-hmm. And so James Bond, as the best shot in the service, has been tagged for sniper duty to look for the sniper on the Soviet side and take the sniper out before the Soviet sniper can take out the agent who's running across. Mm-hmm. And the reason that they can do this is they know when the crossing will occur. It will occur between 6 and 7 p.m. on one of 3 successive nights. So we have the interesting spycraft setting up the situation where Bond gets his notice. He gets quick sniper refresher training. Just, get back into the groove because you're about to be set up to do this the next day.
Yep.
So you have that detail, and then he flies in. They set up his sniper's nest. So you have the whole flavor of getting this together. And we also discover some interesting notes in terms of time, that this is just before this exact section of ground would become Checkpoint Charlie. So this is before Checkpoint Charlie is built. In fact, between the time that the story was penned and the time it was published, the Berlin Wall would go up. So this is just at the birth of the Berlin Wall.
Right.
So that's the territory he has to run across. And I find that historically interesting.
Yeah, definitely. It gives you a little bit of insight. Again, it's very much the era in which the story was written, and that's what you really get that flavor of it. So it's definitely interesting, and I do like the setup as well. They have him going to a shooting range to practice with the type of gun he's going to be using in the type of light situations he's going to be in. And although the range officer seems to not understand, like, why would he come at this time? The light's fading. Why would he want to be here? It's very interesting to see that kind of build up, that kind of preparation. Even though it's not much of an action sequence, it's interesting.
Yeah, I really like the build up, and also talking about things like boredom and how you go stir crazy waiting for the appointed hour. And he's got this crappy novel to read, mm-hmm. and how the bed is set up so it's just the perfect little sniper's nest with so many mattresses piled on top of each other, and how they're trying to keep the light away, and how they have a distraction set up so that when his spotter notices the guy coming across, they have a fellow agent who has a car set to backfire to cover up the noise of the shots. Now, what they have across the street is an orchestra that plays every night at roughly the same time. And what they don't clue in on is that this is the Soviets' version of providing noise to cover for the sound of gunshots for their own sniper. And as we all know, while James Bond is waiting for all of this to happen, he happens to notice a beautiful cello player who he thinks is just gorgeous. And who is he going to see in the sniper's nest on the Soviet side but the cello player? Just like in the movie. Or is it? What did you think about how this part played out?
It was very similar, except for the motivation, I think, was different than the way they played it out in the movie. In the story, he's essentially turned off from killing her just because she's a girl. It has nothing to do with, in the movie, it's because he's like, oh, she's not holding the rifle right. This isn't a real sniper. Something else is going on here. I need to get to the bottom of this. Whereas in the short story, it's just like, oh, she's hot. Let's not kill her right now. And, you can tell that the Bond really isn't as into his job at that moment as he may have previously been. In fact, I think he wonders if M's going to fire him for this, and doesn't really care if that's the case or not.
Yeah, I really saw some Fleming Bond fatigue here, and I agree with you. He had no reason not to shoot her. We have every indication that she was a real sniper. Mm-hmm. And now, admittedly, he does more damage. Instead of just shooting the stock of the rifle out of the way, he shoots right through her hand. She's never going to be able to shoot a rifle again. But as far as we are concerned, she is a real Soviet sniper, and he let her go because she was hot.
Yep.
And that strikes me as wrong.
Yeah, it's very un-Bond-like. Yes, it would be much more Bond-like for him to have slept with her first and then to shoot her when it came time. But it doesn't really. Yeah, it didn't strike me as very Bond-like. So it was a little rough.
But that's the Living Daylights. now we get to the story that was added in a later edition and has been published in editions of Octopussy ever since, and is now rounds out the most common collection. Again, 007 in New York was only put in a much, much later edition, and in fact, it's still there. The edition that we used with the 3 stories is still the most common one published new. So we're only going to go this far, and that is Property of a Lady. And this is utilizing a scene that would end up appearing in Octopussy under a little bit different circumstance. So it's not exactly, the way it plays out in the movie, but you get that same flavor to it. And it's another one of those stories where James Bond doesn't really need to be there at all. It's just an excuse to write a story in an auction house. And considering the original provenance of the story, when you realize that it was published for the Sotheby's Annual, then it becomes clear as to why this was written. It was just basically so be a story for that publication. And the other interesting thing about it is you could argue that Ian Fleming is lifting from another source for his inspiration for this scene, because this was written after North by Northwest came out as the Alfred Hitchcock movie, which also features a scene in the auction house that involves some interesting intelligence operations. So I'm not calling him a plagiarist. I'm just saying, because it does play differently. But I would not be surprised if there's not some inspiration going on here.
I could definitely see that.
So, how would you describe how this story plays out?
It's like I said, it's very similar. We do see some elements of the movie where we see the kind of events play out. Obviously, we're not dealing with an egg specifically. We're dealing with I believe it was a clock, was it not?
Yeah, it was a globe clock, also done by Fabergé, and so we also have the Fabergé connection in Octopussy. I think that's where they pulled that from. But it's actually supposed to be even more valuable than the eggs are. And what we have is an agent that the Brits know is a Soviet agent, and they have created an entire false department around her to disinform the Soviet Union. But they also know she's never been paid, and they can't figure out what's going on with that until she gets a package delivered to her that's insured for up to £100,000. And they find this odd, and they discover that it is, in fact, this Fabergé item, and that they even have reason to suspect that it is genuine, and that she's going to then auction it off and then get her payment, and that's how the Soviets are actually paying her for her services. However, they also have a twist. I think this is taking it a little bit too far, where they say that, well, yes, the Soviets have it, but they just consider it some capitalist bauble, and they think it's maybe worth £20,000, which is what they expect to pay her, but they have no idea what it's really worth because they don't understand capitalism at all. I think that's stretching ignorance a bit far.
Yes.
I mean, yes, if you read actual accounts of how the Soviet Union was at the time and how officials acted, there were some who refused to talk in anything but ideals. But if you think they didn't actually understand the value of money, that's silly. That's not true at all. And I think that Fleming stretched it a bit, but of course we all know his background as well. He is a red-hating British patriot. So, and so knowing this, M just calls Bond into a meeting describing what's happening, and it doesn't make sense at first because M is just like, well, just thought you should know. And Bond is like, well, what if we used this to then find out who the chief resident of the KGB is in London? In other words, the head of spies for the KGB in London. And this is presented as never having occurred to M, in which case, why exactly was Bond called into the meeting again?
They're just telling him. They're just like, hey, this is what's going on. See you later.
So Bond comes up with the idea that if they go to the auction, then, of course, they're going to try. The KGB is probably going to be represented in the audience, and they're going to try and push the bidding up as high as it can go, just to get the maximum payout to their agent against legitimate buyers. So Bond's task is to spot the agent.
which is a little incongruous considering they just said that the Russians don't know how much it's valued and think that she's going to get about a quarter of what she'll probably get for it. So it seems interesting that they'd be there to push the price up even further.
Yeah, but now that part I was okay with, but it's just because the story mechanic, it would work. And even if they didn't know what the value was, if they thought they'd have to push it up at like 15, 16, I can still see that. They may not understand that it's going to go as high as it is, but I can still picture them being there. So then Bond arranges to have a chat with the person who is most likely to bid the highest, which seems kind of unnecessary, but he does. They have a talk basically for the sake of the audience. Yep. This is like Clarence Leiter and Card Sense Jimmy Bond discussing how Baccarat is played in the 1954 Casino Royale. Because the whole point of this is just to tell the audience how auctions work. That's it. There's no other point to this. There's no reason this had to happen. So we learn about this, and then, of course, we have the bidding up in the auction, and Bond is trying to spot the Russian. And he does on the very last try, but Bond didn't need to be there because there was already an agency cameraman who had spotted the same thing without all of this discussion. Bond did not need to be there at all. There was no reason for it. Of course, he tails the agent just to make sure he goes directly to the Soviet embassy, because being the chief resident of the KGB who has eluded British notice for years, he's still that stupid, because he's Russian, apparently. But there was just no reason for Bond to be there.
It's another one of those stories when it's interesting because it does at least play enough on the imagery is there because of the movie, because that scene was kind of lifted and twisted around to fit into the movie of Octopussy. But by itself, I don't think it's a particularly strong story. It's not bad. It's interesting. It's a fun read. Again, these are short stories, so you're not wasting a lot of time reading through them. It's not like you're investing the amount of time necessary to read an entire book to read these. So it's definitely worth checking out, but definitely not the strongest.
Yeah, I mean, all 8 of these stories, even though they're collected in 2 quote-unquote books, are smaller than the average modern novel and only slightly longer than the average Fleming novel. So it's a pretty quick collection to go through. They add color, they add flavor into the Bond universe. They give you some more insight as to where some of these other details from movies came from. And also they give you a little insight into the psychology of Ian Fleming as a writer and where he was going with things. So with that in mind, now that we've discussed the short stories, we're going to go straight away into rating them from 8 to 1. Again, we are not going to be including the existence of 007 in New York. We may cover that at a later date. We're just looking at the 8 stories included in the standard collections of For Your Eyes Only and Octopussy.
All right.
So who would like to start with their number 8?
I'll go ahead. I think I made I think anybody listening would guess this by this point based on my comments on the story.
Before we start, how do you how many do you think we'll agree on? I'm just curious.
Being that there's only 8, I'm guessing that our number 8s might be the same. I don't know beyond that. I mean, obviously, none of them are going to be too far off. None of them could be more than 8 places from each other. I think we might agree on number 8. I don't know. From there forward, I don't really know. It could be interesting.
I do not think we're going to agree on number 8. I think we might. I think we'll end up agreeing in our top 3, but not necessarily in the same order.
All right.
That's my guess.
All right. Well, we'll see.
So now that we've made our bets, sorry to interrupt. I forgot to do that before we started. What's your number 8, sir?
My number 8 is the one in which not only is Bond not a participant in the story at all, but the story that he's not a participant of is boring by Bond standards and not spy-like at all in any way, shape, or form. And knowing now that it was first published in Cosmo magazine makes it all the more reason to be my number 8, and that, of course, is Quantum of Solace. I did not... this one really was the weak link of the bunch for me.
Okay, any further commentary there, or do you think enough said there?
Yeah, I think we talked about it enough. Like I said, it's just to me it was a boring daytime television type storyline being told with Bond as just a listener who, his only thought on the subject was, it makes all this real life drama makes my spy work seem boring. No, it really doesn't. So, definitely the weak link for me.
Okay, fair enough. Now, this is where we find out that my overall assessment of the stories is I didn't like 4 of them, and then the top 4 were either it was okay or I liked it. So,
so none of them really stood out as being great, and I agree with that. I don't think of any of them as bad, like horrible. Quantum of Solace would be the closest to that for me, but I also didn't rank any of them as, oh my gosh, this is so great. It was more of, this one was all right.
I would say that I have 2 that go above this is all right. I would say I go 2 that are good, but not awesome. So, different levels there. There is a distinction. But for my number 8, the edition of the book in which this appears that I read from, somebody on the blurb for the book jacket called this story some of the finest writing that Ian Fleming ever did. I can only assume that the person was excessively drunk, high, or just was wearing completely the wrong prescription glasses or something. Because I pretty much hated this story start to finish. And it ended up just making me kind of angry to read it through several portions of it.
Okay.
And that is the Hildebrand Rarity from For Your Eyes Only. I effing hate this story. There are so many things about it I don't like. I felt the writing was kind of lazy for a lot of it. I hate the character of Milton Crest, and while hating the villain can be a good thing, there's nothing around him to prop him up, because to prop up the other side. Because, okay, you're supposed to really hate the villain, but then they're supposed to be opposite good. So that way they match each other up really well. And nope, Bond is basically a non-participant who wusses out for most of this story, if not all of it, really. And I didn't think it was well written. I didn't like any of the characters. I didn't like Bond. I didn't think this was a Bond-ish story at all. I hated everything about this story. So, yeah, number 8, the Hildebrand Rarity. Yuck.
Well, I wasn't too far off on you there. I do have the Hildebrand Rarity as my number 7. So it didn't beat out Quantum of Solace by much, but the fact that Bond was even a slight participant in it, ranked it just a little bit above Quantum of Solace for me, but not by much. I agree with you. Like we discussed, there were so many times that I was just disappointed in Bond. It's like, yeah, the bad guy's supposed to be bad, and yes, I hated him, and I wanted him to die painfully, and for that, I was at least not disappointed in the fact that he did end up dying, and probably in a fairly painful fashion. But so many times I was disappointed in Bond that it did make it a poor Bond story. So I do agree with you there, but I still think it had just enough of Bond to rank it slightly, just one tiny little half a tick above Quantum of Solace for me. Not saying it was great, but that's the only reason it's above it for me.
Fair enough.
So who'd you have at your 7 spot?
At my 007 spot, which in a list this short is not exactly the place of honor.
Not really, no.
That would be similarly disappointing and involving fish, Octopussy. The Mountaineer's Tale could have been interesting, but I just didn't really like the writing. There was nothing about this story that grabbed me, even though the plot could have. I mean, this has the potential to have been a much better story, but it just struck me again as lazily written. It struck me as Fleming not really at his best. And again, this was published posthumously, so it's entirely possible that this may not have been totally finished. Mm-hmm. So it may have needed a polish to go. No one can say for sure. I wouldn't be surprised. This story does nothing for me. And again, the idea that, okay, you have Bond saying, I got into this because this character was like a father to me, but yeah, I'm just going to let you sit for 2 weeks. And the thing with the octopus stuff was just corny. It did nothing for me. So yeah. My number 7 is Octopussy.
All right. Well, again, not too far off from you, because my number 6 spot is, in fact, Octopussy. Same reasons. Again, no Bond action whatsoever. The only reason it ranks above the Hildebrand Rarity for me is because that at least there was some interestingness to the story that was being told, but it really, I mean, and I wasn't as disappointed in Bond. I was disappointed because, again, why are you giving the guy 2 weeks, and why aren't you just killing him yourself? That's what you should be doing. If you're not going to arrest him and let him die in prison, which would be just as good, why are you allowing him to, even the opportunity to escape if he were to try? Because you don't know at this point how much of the gold he still may have. He might have a big chunk that if he sold off real quick, he could hide very well. It's like you said, it's just tough to see him doing that, and then when you throw in the emotional aspect of the fact that the man who was murdered was supposed to be like a father to him, it just doesn't make any sense. So that's why it ranks down at number 6 for me.
All right. Now, my number 6 is the story that gives the other story collection its title, and that would be For Your Eyes Only, The Cozy Motel. Okay?
That killed it for you, did it?
Well, that was part of it, and it really was part of it, because that just strikes me as so non-Bond. It's just The Cozy Motel, really? I mean, on the one hand, chipmunks. He loves chipmunks. I'm okay with that detail. That kind of detail is kind of cool. But just, it's a story that felt like it should have been a better read. It should have had more intensity to it, and instead, it just struck me almost like Northwood's Deer Hunter Weekly in terms of how it played out. It just did nothing for me. And so, number 6, The Cozy Motel, For Your Eyes Only.
This is funny. So that would bring me to my number 5, which was For Your Eyes Only. This one, again, it had some interesting aspects. We're starting to get into almost get into the better half of the short stories, but again, still, a common theme for all of these short stories for me was that it left me wanting more, and not always in a good way. Sometimes it was just that it felt incomplete. And obviously it's a short story, that's kind of what it's supposed to be, but at the same time, what was there didn't always meet up to expectations either. I don't like my Bond getting snuck up on. I don't care, yes, it's supposed to establish that, she's really good at this because she's been, wanting to do this for so long or whatever, but still, it's Bond. He should know better. He just made a comment about how when deer walk through, they don't snap any twigs because they know better. And then he hears a twig snap and he goes, it's probably a deer. You're like, what? Wait, you just told yourself, you just said that that's not what they do, and then you just convinced yourself that that's exactly what happened. What's wrong with you? So, yeah, I agree. Not a strong story, and The Cozy Motel does not do it any favors.
So then that brings us to what I think will be our equilibrium point and probably our biggest disagreement of the entire thing. At my number 5, Quantum of Solace.
There we go. I was like, when is it going to come back around?
And the reason it gets up this high is, one, Bond does nothing to disappoint me directly, which he does in these other stories. So Bond himself doesn't do anything wrong, because as we noted, he just shows up. And 2, even though I was appalled most of the time I read the story, I was appalled at what the characters were doing to each other. What I was not appalled at was the style of writing. Even though the subject matter was not Bondinosity, it was still good writing. It was effective. And I also really like that theory of Quantum of Solace. I thought that was a very interesting piece of human psychology, and I thought it was very well played out, well described, and yeah, the story's ugly. It's not something I particularly want to read again, but it was well written ugly, and the psychology was actually interesting. I'm not saying it would hold up if you talk to a professional. I don't know if it would, but it seems it was interesting. Appalling, but interesting. And since Bond himself didn't do anything to screw it up, it made it to number 5.
All right. Well, that's obviously not my number 4, since we already know that it's my number 8. So
now it'll be interesting to see if we play this game again.
Yeah. So my number 4 then is one that you haven't mentioned yet. So at least we know that the top 4 we know that our top 4 match up. Whether or not they're in anything close to the same order is up for debate. My number 4 is The Living Daylights. I felt that of the remaining stories, this was the one that takes that bottom position, mostly because of the fact that, as we discussed, it was a very un-Bond-like decision to be made. Yes, we know he's into girls, and yes, we know he likes to sleep with anything that moves, and if a hot girl walks by, he's going to take notice, but it's never been the type of thing that would interfere him doing his job. And in this situation, in the movie, at least they gave him good reason to not kill her. You know, they gave him that, hey, wait a minute, she's not holding the gun right. This can't be right. Something's wrong here. I'm not going to kill her because I need to get to the bottom of this because there's something deeper here. And in the short story, it was just like, ooh, she's hot. I don't want to kill her. Let's just shoot her hand. Well, on the one sense, it's a little more cruel to shoot her in the hand as opposed to just shooting the gun out of her hand. But at the same time, not killing her just because she's hot is not my Bond. But that's also a trend that I think we see in these short stories. It's not the Bond we're used to. But other than that, I thought it was a fairly well-written story. I liked the build-up. I liked the insight into the preparation. So that was fun. And, but the ending brought it down to number 4 for me.
Fair enough. I can understand your reasoning. That said, I had different reasoning. So my number 4 is The Property of a Lady. And the reason that made my number 4 is it did nothing to actively piss me off, which makes it better than the 4 that came before.
Yeah.
But it still was the, why is Bond here? Bond didn't need to be there. And while interesting, the discussion between Bond and the other gentleman, once I made the mental connection between that and Card Sets Jimmy Bond and Clarence Leiter talking about Baccarat, it couldn't get any higher than 4 for me after that. That comparison just ruined it. So that's why Property of a Lady made number 4 for me. Though with that said, I would like them to find a way to use that as a title for a new James Bond movie. I think that would be awesome.
It would be good. Yeah, that would definitely be better than some of the other ones.
And I would say that would also be a great title for a James Bond movie, specifically featuring Mila Jovovich as the villain.
I could get down with that.
Just want to get that one back out there, folks. Come on, grassroots campaign. Let's get it going. Mila Jovovich, Bond villain, Property of a Lady. Make it happen.
There we go. We should put together a meme, throw it up on the Facebook page, and see if we can't get that going viral. Maybe somebody will take notice. Well, as in true fashion for this list anyway, my number 3 is Property of a Lady. Just one off from you, just one up there. I agree. It was a good story. However, as you described, Bond didn't really have to be there. And luckily, I didn't really make that connection with Card Smart Jimmy Bond until you said it. So I didn't have that hanging over my head as I was reading it. But I did understand that it was kind of like, okay, this is an explanation scene, but it wasn't as tedious as some other ones that we've heard. Some of the descriptions of, like, for example, the golf game in Goldfinger was tedious and boring.
Just terrible.
It wasn't long enough to have that tediousness to it. It was just kind of a passing. It was kind of unnecessary. But other than that, I thought it was a fairly good story, and I especially liked the way it invoked Octopussy for me, because the scene is basically lifted from this short story to place in that movie. So,
all right. And in true form to the list, as we have had it so far, my number 3 is The Living Daylights. And I completely agree with you that the ending was terrible in terms of the why, because we're not really given one, and the one we're left to think about is because she's hot.
Yeah.
And that just strikes me as wrong, which is really too bad, because everything up to that point was fabulous. If it weren't for the why on shooting the sniper, this would have easily been the best story for me. Because the preparation, the planning, the historical details, the physical descriptions of everything were all really well done. But then I just decided to shoot her in the hand because, she was attractive and a woman. And, she'd have been on this side. I could have boned her. I mean, no. In the movie, I thought it was very well played. And that motivation makes all the difference. Mm-hmm. The motivation of, I don't think she's a real sniper. That is, to borrow your phrase, that's my Bond. That makes sense. And that's commendable. But the way that it happens in this story doesn't work for me. And it's the ending specifically that knocks it down to number 3. Otherwise, I love it.
Yep, I definitely agree. So then, do we want to flip-flop? Since we know there's only 2 stories left, and we both have the same 2 stories in our top 2, do we want to flip-flop and announce number 1 next?
Sounds good. And What's your bet? Do we agree or not?
Ooh, it's tough. Everything else has been just like one-off here, there. So I'm going to guess no, just because it seems the safer bet. But
and just to be funny,
it's literally
I am
a 50-50
going to
chance.
agree that we're going to disagree. Let's see how we do.
So what do you have at number 1?
At number 1, despite my problems with the accents, I went with Risico. And I went with it because it just played out as a good Bond adventure from start to finish, and Bond never screwed up. I mean, yes, he got captured, but he got captured in a way that's par for the course. It wasn't going to be something that killed him, so his screw-up wasn't a horrible one. And I suppose it also helps that I had the visual from the movie to keep me going through the story.
Yeah.
So I just thought it was a solid Bond adventure. It was good. And it just... I think the movie visual is what carried it over to number 1 for me over the other one.
Okay.
So my number 1 is Risico.
All right. Making your number 2 my number 1 From A View to a Kill. I thought it just had a little bit more. I think the fact that it was actually different from the movies, and the fact that while it had the movie feel to some of it, it wasn't a story that was actually in the movies. I think that's what lifted it above Risico for me, because I did like Risico as well. That is my number 2, of course, obviously from process of elimination there. And for all the reasons you said, it was a good adventure story, and the visuals definitely kept it together because I was thinking of the movie as I was listening to it. But with A View to a Kill, even though the title is from the movie, you got nothing else. And it was a fun story. I really liked the action sequence at the beginning, and the Bondinessosity level was definitely there with the hidden base. So that's why it kind of barely bumped out Risico, but it did.
I also, of course, really liked From A View to a Kill, as noted. It's, by process of elimination, my number 2. The two things that dropped it down, because otherwise it was, again, a fun Bond adventure story. Played really well overall. I liked the action sequences. The two things that bugged me were the Bond's stupid mistake at the end where he ends up having to get saved by the star-crossed female agent. And it's not the fact that he has to get saved by, it's the fact that he's so stupid to have it happen. But the thing that really kind of did it was just the creepy factor of his prostitution fantasy is what made it my number 2.
Okay. Yeah, that definitely was a little unnecessary, but it's still, for this group of stories, I guess my overall impression is that they are nowhere near as strong as the full novels. While there are still some good elements, and it does add, like you said, it's kind of like the spice needed to, it's the salt and pepper of the Bond universe in the books. It adds a little bit here and there. You get to see a little bit of how the sausage is made when it comes to the movies that aren't based on the books that we've already discussed. So it's definitely worth reading. If you've read the rest of the books but have held off on reading these for whatever reason, I would say don't. Go ahead and read them. It's like we said, you're not going to spend that much time. Both books together are about as long as one regular book, so you're not going to waste a bunch of time with this, and it does add that little bit of extra seasoning to the mix.
Yeah, and like you said, it's kind of a salt and pepper thing. It allows Ian Fleming to push it real something. Not necessarily push it real good, but just go outside of his boundaries. Because obviously Cosmo, Sotheby's Annual, but it shows either experimenting with ideas for what he could do with Bond as a spy, or expressing his frustrations, or just seeing if he could write anything else. So it's an interesting look at Fleming as a writer as well. And for anyone who isn't sure if they want to actually make a large investment, like you said, if you're going to read the books anyway, then this is a very good supplemental material. So I would agree with Eric. Even if some of the stories are substandard or even bad, it's still worth your time.
I definitely agree. Definitely give it a read. And if you, like we said before, if you do happen to have or get a hold of the version of Octopussy that includes 007 in New York, we'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So hit us up and let us know. And of course, as always, if you have any questions or comments about the show, this episode or any previous episodes, let us know. We want to hear from you.
Yeah, you can find me at Ziggy at cinemaontherocks.com. You can find me on Twitter at cinemaotr. You can find the show in general at hermajestiespod.com. And that is also where you can find every single episode we have ever recorded, including some things that we may find embarrassing from older episodes by now. Because, this is our 31st. Yeah. Hey, how about that? We've been around a while. Because, of course, no matter what platform you're catching us on, whether it's Spreaker or iTunes or anything else, eventually the older episodes do fall off because they only let us keep a certain amount of episodes there. But even the ones that have fallen off of your particular platform of choice, you can always go to hermajestiespod.com and you can download the episodes from there.
Yes. They're also still available on 4eyeradio.com. If you just go to the bi-weekly show listings and choose our show, you'll find all of our episodes there as well. So we try to make it as easy as possible. We have it on all the easy mobile platforms like Stitcher and SoundCloud. But like you said, those things do drop off after a certain amount of time, especially when we're on a network with so many different shows. So it does behoove you, if you want to check out those older episodes, to jump on over to our website and check them out. Plus, you can leave comments directly on the episodes, which we can see and respond to.
Indeed. But any other thoughts you have on the short stories?
No, I would definitely, like I said, recommend reading them if you've read the rest of the books, and or if you've seen the movies and want to know a little bit more about the background. Like we said, it's kind of a look behind the curtain to see where some of these story elements and titles came from that weren't wholly based on novels.
Indeed. But that's going to do it for this episode of Her Majesty's Secret Podcast. Join us next time when we will be taking a bit of a commercial break. Yes, we're going to be talking about product placement in the James Bond film universe, so stay tuned for that. Meanwhile, I'm Ziggy Berkeley.
And I'm Eric Dewey.
And you have been listening to Her Majesty's Secret Podcast, only on The Fern.
This has been another great presentation of the 4-Eyed Radio Network. You can catch more shows at 4eyeradio.com.